today, and thank you, and thanks to all the colleagues and everyone who's joined us this afternoon. Yes, we've been asked to speak a little bit on a topic that I suppose would generate some discussion, but certainly has some interest with everybody. We're both co-presenting today. I will take a first set of the presentation, and then I will give an indication where Lebo, my colleague from UKZN, will join us. So let me start by saying something about what we're doing today. Of course, you can see the title of the presentation there. And just to say very briefly, we've come to this presentation in a way reflecting our interest in the topic, obviously, of critical food studies, of which this project is part of, led by Professor Lewis at UWC, and of course, Prof. Moletsane at UKZN and myself at UP, with a number of students and colleagues involved in the project. And of course, it's a topic that is of interest, and in particular here, the question of cookbooks, but more specifically, I think in this instance, the question of curry. We call it our material interest in curry, and I'm sure many in this virtual space have an interest in curry, obviously eating it, which I think is important. We're not eating at the moment, but also reflecting our intellectual curiosity about what could be called an iconic dish in some ways. So what we're presenting today is briefly, in some ways, a Reader's Digest version, an abbreviation of an article that we have published in Gender Questions. It was a special edition focused on critical food studies with a strong humanist lens, reflecting on gender. And so in this presentation today, we'll make some top-line observations reflecting insights and key messages from the more detailed article. And perhaps to say in this presentation, we're telling a story, not the story, about the very multi-layered meanings of curry in some ways. But we focus to a large extent on what could be labeled, as you'll see, a regional dish, something called Durban curry. I think many might have a sense of what it might be, and many might say, I have no clue as to what it might entail. In a way, Durban curry representing a specific part of the geography of South Africa and, of course, KwaZulu Natal. And we do this largely in relation to two recently published cookbooks. Maybe I should say something about the title before I move into the next observation. It's titled In Search of the Perfect Curry, and of course it's unoriginal at that. It's a title we appropriate from Rick Stein, the very famous celebrity chef, restaurateur, and television presenter, who wrote a book based on a television series, Rick Stein's India, In Search of the Perfect Curry. And in that text, he says that he visited India across all regions to search for a perfect curry, to understand Indian food in all its complexities in the Indian heartland. But of course, as we discover, he never really finds the perfect curry. And what he does discover instead is that curry is a word that very broadly describes all of the cooking of the Indian subcontinent. And in a way, we would say that this deduction by Stein is also incorrect. What he finds, we think, is probably a mixture of colors, flavors, aromas, techniques, and varieties that reflect a range of options. In a way, therein lies the clue to our presentation and our ideas that there is a supposed or perceived essence to what curry entails. I should emphasize in this particular presentation, we are not focused on the broad material and representational history of curry, or neither in its broad political economy. Of course, we can get into that, but that's not the key focus here, representing interests, politics, and conflicts, and economics. But we're really interested in, at some level, in describing a particular regional dish in relation to a cookbook, and providing some sort of discursive insights, drawing on a vast interdisciplinary toolbox in reading these two cookbooks dedicated to this creature called curry. Lebo will, of course, talk more about that in the presentation. Of course, I want to say that we see cookbooks to a large extent as primary documents that tell us stories that reveal much about an author's interpretation of the communities and the kind of visions they have of the society and culture in those communities. Perhaps we move to the second slide, Heather. So our focus in this presentation is to offer some perspectives about a conceptual frame, after which we turn to something about curry, telling some story about it, its etymology, in other words, its origin in some ways, at least the way we've come to understand it in the critical literature, to turn briefly to some gendered meanings of food work by asking, what do cookbooks do, including some of their gendered dimensions. Of course, cookbooks tell stories, but they do more than just that. And then we zero in on the two texts that I'm talking about, and you'll see that in a minute, which we read against the grain of another iconic cookbook in South Africa in a way that is the broad frame of the presentation. So perhaps the third slide. So, yeah, so in this particular slide, you see the covers of the two texts that we will focus on. Obviously, Lebo will give us more of an insight into these two texts when she gets to her slides about the content of the books, etc., published respectively. Durban Curry, So Much Off Flavor. Note how interesting the subtitle is, so much off, grammatically representing regional kind of language or inflection in some ways, in a stereotypical way. It's the first book that was published in 2014 by Erika Platter and Clinton Friedman. And a new book followed a few years later, 5 years later, in 2019. Of course, we'll hear a little more about this later, titled Durban Curry, Up to Date. And of course, people who are aware of Up to Date will have a better sense of what that entails and why Up to Date has much to say about food as well. Perhaps we move from there to the next slide. And so, yes, I think this is also important for our audience, participants, and readers to have a sense, in thinking about these cookbooks, we recognize that, cookbooks always have a deep history. I mean, of course, they may be self-standing in many, many ways, but there are many intertexts, as it were, to the cookbooks that we read. There's always something that precedes a text in a way that we recognize. Whether it's a cookbook or a novel or a film, there's always some sort of interrelationship. So it's what we mean by the intertext to a large extent, that there are relationships between texts, whether they're literary or non-literary, always in a way generating some sort of connection to something prior. And in a way, an intertext always has something to do with the structure of influence and the layers of depth to a text that one is working with, and how that might also have some implications with an author's or a reader or people who are reading the text, as we are in this case, some sort of prior knowledge of other texts, as it were. The truth here is that there are so many books that focus on curry, and I've just illustrated a few, and I'm not saying all of these books simply focus on curry, but one in particular. So there are many that reflect in some ways a type of cuisine across its vast geopolitics beyond the Indian subcontinent, and including very much so in the diaspora as well. One of those, for example, is a local text written by Ishay Govender called Curry, Stories and Recipes Across South Africa, which is really a fascinating account of South African curry beyond, provinces, as it were. 90 recipes feature in the book, the result of conversations with a number of people, cooks and experts, that really show the aromatic flavors of curry, whether you're in KwaZulu Natal, or whether you're in Cape Town, or whether you're in Calvinia, or Orlando West in Soweto, or Kunu, fascinating account of recipes and stories. Another related text is Cape Curry and Koo Sisters, written by twin sisters Fatima and Khadija, who take us very interestingly on a Cape Malay food trip, which is in their sense, as they describe it in this fascinating book, a journey of life with recipes and memories from their childhood emanating at the Cape Flats. Fascinating cookbook with its beautiful recipes and stories. Of course, more locally in Durban, a book titled Casbah, Family Recipes for Every Festive Season. And the Casbah, rather interestingly, is an area in Durban, located in Durban's Grey Street. And Casbah is an Arabic word, often translating to mean old city, or a blockhouse, or a structure of buildings, but old city would probably mean something to everybody, written by a group of people. And in fact, the book is the result of a popular Grey Street recipe group, which comprises over 238,000 people, rather interestingly. Fascinating recipes. Of course, curries feature there. More recently, and I think last year, Nakia Mayat published this fascinating book called The Beginning, a debut cookbook written in a very modern style, focusing on what she would term modern Indian cuisine. And it's really a book about a culinary journey reflecting, very interestingly, both stories and recipes that are both vibrant and nostalgic. So you get a sense that some of these elements creep through. So one could go on and on talking about, what does this have to do with the kind of two texts that we're studying or engaging or speaking about today. The point here is to really show that cookbooks have a lineage, a broader set of intertexts that speak to each other in different ways. If I could turn then to slide 5, Heather. So coming to the intertext, in some ways, as we were thinking, both Gleb and I, about this piece and the ideas, and I've just explained, why intertext is somewhat important. And we probably won't go into great depth here, but really to say that, in thinking about Durban Curry, the two cookbooks that we're focusing on, we couldn't help but think about an iconic cookbook in South Africa that most South Africans of Indian descent probably know. Probably one of the most, well-sold books, if I could put it like that, and written by Zuleka Mayat in 1961, a doyen of food in South Africa, and features a range of recipes. In fact, written as a collective by the Durban Women's Cultural Group, has had several editions. First, the picture there on the left is really the first edition cover. It's had several iterations, interestingly, and very interestingly, a text that contains, many recipes and limited stories, but, features rice dishes and curries, vegetables, and convalescent food, really focusing on food that helps healing and so on and so forth, and really became a benchmark as an authoritative guide, designed initially, very interestingly, as it was framed for the South African Indian housewife. So sense the gender speculation and skepticism there. But interestingly, the text really has evolved over the decades to attract and appeal to both Indians and non-Indians, if I could put it in that way. Basically, South Africans of broader hues across color lines, etc. And I think that has much to do with the fact that South African society has evolved in so many different ways, and that, food, in a way like curry, is dynamic, and, we get exposed through interactions, through a range of things. We make the observation that, that text is somewhat, designed at the time in a very gendered way. Of course, one must recognize the context also. I mean, for example, Mayat says in the text that the new homemaker rather interestingly, must be aware that the health of a family is in our hands. Shortcuts and improvising may be resorted to, but vital principles are not to be compromised. Very much aligned to the idea that, this is a book about method, idea, keeping the family happy, and indeed your husband preparing food. Very interestingly. So in a way, what we're saying that the two Durban curry texts, which we turn to next, take us in a way beyond the history of apartheid and the kind of context of the 60s, etc., and beyond the ethnoscapes of Indian delights in some ways. There have been fascinating studies at an academic level written about Indian delights. I'm not going into that. We do scratch on the surface of that in the paper, but we use this reference as a text, intertext, to suggest that the text that we're proposing here or engaging Durban Curry, in a way, takes us to other zones of opportunities and interpretations and offer some counter narratives that really move across race, ethnicity, age, and national origin. Next slide, Heather. And some might ask, so what is our conceptual frame in this particular set of ideas that we're proposing? Of course, they might seem like concepts to you, but they really, help to structure our arguments in this text. They're shaping ideas to our thinking and approach in many ways. Cookbooks to a large extent are texts. We read them as texts. They're a form of expository writing. In other words, they describe and explain certain things. And we anchor our analysis in this particular frame or mode of thinking in a way that sees cookbooks as acts of codification. In other words, they help to classify foods in the broader foodways and foodscapes. And they tell a story that is multi-layered. They construct a set of views. They mobilize a reader and an audience and a particular theme beyond providing us with, what's typical in a cookbook: ingredients, cooking methods, recipes, memories, photographic images, and images broadly. Really, if we look at modern cookbooks, contemporary cookbooks, it's the visual that really appeals. It's the cover that draws people to it to a large extent. But we say they're gendered as well, and my colleague Lebo will say more about that. In a way, cookbooks, what they do is capture the past and the present in ways that really get us to think about things in somewhat different ways, and including also being creative. And of course, they contain recipes, very, very important, central to cookbooks. But recipes are also very interesting words. The word recipe comes from Latin and basically means a receipt, or it's derived from the word receipt in Latin, in a way that means to take or to receive. Very interesting if you think about what cookbooks then do insofar as recipes are concerned, to take or receive. In many ways, cookbooks, as I say, no, I'm not done, Heather. Cookbooks are, in many ways, take us to the idea of foodways, which is very important. And foodways, simply put, has much to do with what we consume, how we acquire it, who prepares it, and who is at the table. And in many ways, it also summons our practices, our rituals, and our attitudes around food, and offers us, some window into our beliefs, assumptions, senses, and the world and ourselves in relation to food, which I think is quite critical. So these concepts shape our thinking in this paper. Let's move to the next slide. And so the next slide, please. Thank you. And so what we're trying to say also conceptually is that, food and curry in this instance, it really forms part of what we term contact zones. It's not a concept we've created, but it's a concept we borrow from Mary Louise Pratt, who suggests that, concepts like food, frankly, they meet, they clash, and they grapple with each other. In other words, they suggest some element of relationality and contiguity. In other words, contiguity is about common borders where things touch each other. and take on new meaning. So in a way, we use the concept to describe connections between identity groups that are interacting outside of a specific local physical space. The context zones, in terms of thinking about curry in this context, is very, very special, and really in many ways also speaks to zones of taste, which we borrow from Indian food historian Pushpesh Pant, who tells us that zones of taste really represent a gastronomic heritage. And really, they emphasize material, visceral, and aromatic dimensions aligned to flavor, which in many ways are artificial boundaries. In other words, zones of taste position influences from one region and they take on meanings in another. I mean, one could give an example of that. If one claims, particular spices come from a particular region, let's say in India, and spices only don't emanate from India, such as cinnamon, cardamom, star anise, black pepper, nutmeg, in southern India, they take on new meanings when they are, created in recipes in other parts of the world, in other parts of the country. Similarly, saffron, a very prestigious, important, expensive spice, emanates or is dominant in North India, but not only in that country. Of course, it's available in Persia as well, or Iran. They take on new flavors and tastes. In other words, zones of taste as a concept transcends national and international boundaries, which is a point we're trying to make in relation to curry. And of course, curry, we are suggesting, frankly, is an idea, is a concept, it's a practice. It travels. It knows no boundaries or histories. Well, it might have histories. It represents a problem of translation, perhaps not as a negative, that it is translated, reinterpreted in other contexts. My next slide. Next slide, please. So yes, in this particular slide, I mean, this is an abbreviation of some of the big issues that we pick up in this paper. That really to say that, Indian food, or what it supposedly is, carries tremendous symbolic resonance in and beyond India. Okay, emanating from a subcontinent, but its meanings vary. It is shaped in relation to a global and globalizing landscape. And very importantly, we say it is more, Indian cuisine is more than just the curry. The curry has become a catch-all term for Indian food. Of course, the word in our research suggests that it can be traced to around 1598 and probably used in one of the recipes, I think, in colonial projects around the 17th century. It's more than just simply the curry. I mean, things that we often see in Indian restaurants, tandoori, korma, vindaloo, chicken tikka masala, rogan gosh, and so on, really, frankly speaking, is a commodification of Indian cuisine in a global economy. In fact, even the word curry is a bit of a misnomer, frankly, as we've come to understand in our research, even including in India, but has taken on special meanings throughout the world as becoming emblematic, as we say, of particular identities. And of course, as you can see in brackets on that slide, really the role of colonialism in terms of that. But the word curry itself equally has a very interesting origin. South Asian roots, largely India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. And of course, curries don't only belong to the South Asian subcontinent. It's available across the world in Southeast Asia, Africa, the broader diaspora. So it transcends a purely Indian foodscape. And more importantly, just as culture is not stable, food is also equally, in our view, ephemeral and transient. And we say that it has become an adaptive dish. We'll talk about that. And the question around authenticity is really something that we zero in the analysis of this book, that it can be, arbitrary, ambiguous. It's always under construction. Curry is always under construction. Spice too, rather interestingly, it's a common denominator. And even this notion of curry powder is a bit of a misnomer in the country. Of course, I will come to the end of my little slot before I hand over to Lebo in a second. You know, just to sort of complete this local story in some ways in the next slide, you know, a critical ingredient, thank you, next slide, a critical ingredient in something that most South Africans know. The bunny chow, rather interestingly, is curry, one or another form of curry, distinctly South African in so many ways, where the central ingredient, obviously bread, and of course, white bread, not just any bread, has deep, you know, enduring legacy to colonialism, apartheid, and gender disparities, really designed for workers on the run, you know, moving for lunch breaks, and of course the spatial division during apartheid. So particular fast foods became available, and this was quick to have your curry in a hollowed out loaf of bread that people found some sort of sustenance in order to really get going with the day. I think that, just very briefly, to give you a sense of where we're moving. But let's turn now more broadly with my colleague Lebo to the question of cookbooks more specifically and how we come to our topic.
Okay, thank you, Vasu. I guess first I need to address my autobiography of the question. Why is a Mosotho woman interested in saying anything about the curry? First, it is that I love food and I love tasting different foods, curry among them being my comfort food. It has been throughout this lockdown period. And secondly is that I love books of all kinds, including surprisingly cookbooks. Those who know me, Vasu included, will know that I don't cook. I can't cook, even if you paid me. But I own more than 10 cookbooks in my house, and of all different types of cuisines. And the reason I own cookbooks is that I love going through them and reading about the various tastes and the various ways of cooking different dishes. And lastly, very quickly, I'm interested in textual analysis of these books that I own, including novels, cookbooks, and others. So I come at this presentation from a textual analysis point of view. And so going into the presentation itself, our gender analysis of the two texts that Vasu shared with you is informed largely by the pioneering work, at least in South Africa, of our very own Desiree Lewis, who reminds us that apart from the insight provided into certain groups' own knowledge of food, national cuisine, and nutrition, understanding local bodies of knowledge about food would provide crucial avenues into understanding food flows as sites of resistance and socially marginalized groups' agencies. She continues to say that interdisciplinary feminist approaches to food amplify understandings of power, resistance, and freedom in particular contexts. So in other words, cooking carries beyond the material, visceral, and embodied nature of transforming recipes into the practice of eating. So cooking communicates emotional and social connection and speak to the gendered, the ethnic, the racial, and class hierarchies that Vasu has alluded to. So our analysis suggests that cooking and food preparation, as we all know, are contingent on gendered performances of attention and care while at the same time masking very persistent gendered inequalities. The performative labor falls, as we all know, disproportionately on women. So central to food is its construction of relations between men and women, as well as in building and projecting the role of women in maneuvering the meanings of food. So how do the two texts then that Vasu showed you earlier, the Durban curry, so much of flavor, Durban curry, up to date, how do these two texts frame a set of perspectives about foodways and how these perspectives shape or are shaped by gender and other markers of identity, such as ethnicity, race, and class? So just 4 observations to make. First, that while cookbooks can be said to belong to the humble literature, they also contribute in very significant ways to broader social national issues, including the formation of the so-called national cuisine and identity. Second, cookbooks such as the Durban curry represent the popularization of a perceived Indian foodscape. Linked to this, we suggest in our paper that cookbooks are simultaneously nostalgic and that they are mobile and highly gendered. For example, for the food that people eat to become the cuisine that represent the nation or ethnicity and its gendered meanings, recipes have to be written down or cookbooks have to be produced. At the same time, these recipes travel beyond the written, and more so through oral recipe sharing. For example, many of us learned to cook the things that we cook from our mothers and our aunties. The third observation that we make is that we argue in the article that cookbooks tell cultural tales in that they reflect the shifts in the boundaries of edibility and the structure of domestic ideologies, for example. In other words, we see cookbooks as valuable historical and cultural sources that enlighten our history and contemporary existence. Slide 2, please. Or next slide, So Vasu has shared the two texts that we are analyzing here today. Next slide, please. So the first one is the Durban curry, so much of flavor. Our analysis of this text is premised on our understanding that the essence of what constitutes an authentic curry, including the Durban curry, could in fact be a fallacy, and that there is no such thing as a Durban curry. From this perspective, looking at the book, which is subtitled People, Places, and Secret Recipes, what is the Durban curry anyway? So the book motivates that the Durban curry is a very distinctive brand of curry developed in the kitchens and cooking pots of Durban, which developed its own identity in these foreign fields, meaning foreign to India, we take. Part of the title, as Vasu indicated earlier, so much of flavor, is a linguistic variant commonly used by South Africans of Indian origin to overemphasize the quality or quantity of something, and is a very playful, humoristic play on language, accent, and ethnicity in these parts of the world. However, while Durban curry reflects an identity with a specific dish, the exact DNA of the curry is not yet known. Its distinctiveness is in the ingredients used, as well as those that are not used, and the color of the curry itself, in particular, its spiciness and redness. So the search for authenticity then, and a singularity of the essence to a curry suggests another set of meanings in this text that we are talking about. Durban curry is to be identified, described, and defined in its plurality rather than singularity. So across race, across gender, across age, across nationality, and other identity markers, because there are numerous variations, experiences, and indeed more exceptions than rules to the making of the curry. To this effect, the renowned anthropologist and chef Anna Trapido, in reviewing this book, has written, "In Durban curry, so much of flavor, differences are enjoyed. The food is presented as a dynamic, inspiring blend of old and new ingredients and cooking methods. Every recipe makes it clear that migrants are different from those who stay at home. There is a direct, assertive, flexible vigor in Durban curry that is not found in motherland Indian cuisine. It is not better or worse, but just different," end quote, end quote. The stories then told through recipe constructions create an understanding of the Durban curry as an object of a lived experience of food as culture in a regional world, specifically Durban, that while it remains global, it is in many ways also profoundly local to Durban. Next slide, please. So just an indication of the contents of this text, Durban curry, so much of flavor. It is divided into 5 sections with 63 recipes. Some of them look very easy to do, but I wouldn't know. So they range from individual curries, and they straddle beans, using such things as samp and vegetables, meat curries, seafood, sides, and so on and so on. Next slide, please. So the second text, Durban curry up to date. On one hand, it sustains the central thread of curry making and its meanings contained in the previous one that I just presented. In this edition, the authors indicate that the strapline, and I quote, is not simply about contemporary meanings of curry. Rather, the book also references the most desirable variety of a potato called a melter, which apparently cooks more satisfactorily in a curry than other varieties of potato. So the text's main focus is contemporary and focuses on a new generation, or profiles a new generation of chefs, cooks, and curries, new approaches and influences and new imperatives of curry making. In fact, according to the authors, Durban curry is not set in stone. The point about this community dish, which has become a national treasure, is precisely and imprecisely that it is always moved and mutated with the times. It continues, as it did right from the beginning, to respond to new circumstances and needs. So for these authors, the Durban curry, as it turns out, is about color. The redder, the better, is generally accepted as one of its defining characteristics. So this volume, the updated volume, is structured into 13 sections and contains 73 recipes and features a lot of the famous chefs and celebrity chefs that we all know about. Like the Durban curry, so much of flavor. The Durban curry, up to date, is shaped by individual, family, celebrity, and restaurant-driven recipes that share brief yet colorful histories of the recipes. Next slide, please. So what are some of the representational themes that emerge from the two texts? So like its predecessor, running through the second volume is the idea that Durban curry breaks gender stereotypes. The recipes, as the authors argue, cross gender lines. For example, macho men who would not be seen dead baking a cupcake profoundly tout their curry skills. Creating and surviving their heat is somehow regarded as rather manly, end quote. So the two volumes offer representations of culinary masculinities that challenge men's structural dominance, and by so doing, they frame men's cooking as a form of routine culinary production and a feature of routine care work that is so often relegated to women. This, albeit in recipes that are regarded as more acceptable for men to create. So first, both the texts employ personal stories to construct a relational bond with the reader, thus creating a kind of a tourist nostalgia about the curry. For example, in his overview of the sociology of food and eating, McIntosh observes that food, eating, and experiences of the body all have implications that also suggest the emotional is deeply connected to the taste. As the Hayes-Conroys have argued in the literature, attention to the senses is key to understanding visceral experiences of food. The sensory organs capturing textures, aromas, flavors, and so on in creating and triggering cultural memory. So recipes and the narratives that shape the two volumes that we are talking about today rather seductive and craft culinary wells of aspiration about identity, about taste, about smell, and about pleasure. In particular, they envision scenes of cross-cultural encounter, as Vasu indicated, and fantasies about of touristic and gastronomic delight that invite the reader to imagine not only cooking and eating, but also invite them to participate in experiences and interactions in this cosmopolitan space, Durban. Next slide, please. just maybe a few observations about more themes that emerge from the two texts is that they could fall into a typology of what has been described as ethnic cookbooks, in the sense that they are often, they would be referred to as Indian cookbooks. This naming represents a form of cultural co-modification that resonates with other identity markers of socially marginalized groups and their intersecting identities, for example, gender and social class. However, while the texts engage with marginalized identities, they also tap into a diasporic food experience that by all accounts transcend the diaspora in its ethnocentricity, particularly an Indian diaspora. So intertextually, both books draw on the idea of the curry as an ethnic index of identity. Yet the books, beyond their historical, social, and anecdotal references, attempt to inscribe food practice, particularly curry making, within a broader trajectory that surpasses ethnicity and tradition into a more multicultural and non-racial representation. If you page through the book, you'll see the kinds of, or the different ethnicities of the chefs that are profiled, as well as the recipes that they present. So the recipes themselves draw attention to how men, women, and people of diverse backgrounds become markers of their culinary encounters with curry, and also creations of themselves in relation to food, identity, and place. So if we argue that the curry has traveled and is mobile, in these texts, the dish demonstrates a form of cultural patrimony to represent an evolving heritage, symbolic of taste. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to move towards the end, what we are arguing is that food, and in this context, curry, is often used as a mnemonic for us to recall the past or to be nostalgic about the past, and therefore as an extension of our memory, imagined or real. Memories of childhood, we recall the kitchens of our growing up. But what we are also arguing is that it is not about an essence, but an effect of hybridity that is put together by diverse people, not only from the Indian continent, but from the diaspora as well, in a form of food mixing. So I guess our central argument is that there is no one Durban curry. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that brings my section of the presentation to an end. And I'll hand back to Vasu to conclude.
Thank you, Lebo. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I mean, to bring our story to a close, of course, there's no closure is what we're telling in this story about curry. I think Lebo has covered some of the broad critical issues that we raise in the paper, really indicating that the two texts, the two recipe books, really offer, in many ways, markedly different perspectives when compared to Indian Delights. Again, it's not to value one text over the other, but tell us how texts themselves travel and the kind of work that they do with readers and an audience, given the fact that, you know, these are texts from markedly different contexts in our histories, and what they purposefully, intentionally try to recreate and reimagine in Durban Curry, a sort of a multicultural, non-racial, you know, audience receiving curry, appropriating, adapting, making sense of it.
Am I the only one who lost Vasu?
No, I think it's a general problem somewhere.
Yeah,
Okay.
I lost him.
Yeah,
as well.
you're not the only one.
Oh,
I hope he realizes soon.
I'll send him a message, Vasu.
okay, okay. I don't know whether I should, yeah.
I think maybe
I
for
should conclude on his behalf, just to save time. I guess the story we want to tell is that the two cookbooks are representations not only of structures of production and distribution, but they are also representations of identity, such as ethnicity, gender, class, and the hierarchies involved. And that the curry is a product, therefore, an effect of culinary cultural exchanges beyond, for example, the Indian subcontinent, and also beyond Durban itself. I think I will end there unless Vasu is back. Vasu? Okay, so that was our story in this presentation.
Thanks, thanks, Lebo. Vasu was saying that he was going to chair. He asked me earlier on, so since he
Okay, great,
will
thank
come
you.
back, then I think I'll just chair. So we have quite a lot of time for discussion. There are lots of things that I'm wanting to thank you very much for that. Lots of provocations. I think some of the students who are here might be tempted to, if they haven't already decided on their research projects, the route of recipe books. You know, there are so many directions that one can go in. I don't see any comments yet in the chat. If you don't want to raise a hand or don't want to speak, but rather want to write a question in the hand, please, in the chat, please feel free to do so. This is a question, I suppose. Is Vasu, are you still? I see a hand from Pralini. Okay, Pralini, go for it.
Hi there. Thank you, Lebo and Vasu, for that very interesting presentation. Yeah, so sure. Where do I start with this? So I think what I didn't hear in this presentation, so it's a lovely story of, you know, hybridization and moving beyond borders and all of that kind of thing. But what I seemed not to have picked up is who tells the story. And for me, that's quite an important question, because I feel that Durban Indianness is still largely quite a colonial project. A lot of the stories are quite anthropologically told, ethnographic, and, you know, who becomes the data then of these books. And these are these multiple stories that are told in these two cookbooks. And of course, whose name gets to be put onto these books as the authors or editors or whatever it is of the books are still is still largely colonial. And for me, that feels a bit problematic. I did flip through the books. I've never bought those books, and it's probably something I won't buy. Not for political reasons or anything like that, but it's not the way I would cook. And it's not really, I mean, we get to eat that kind of food anyway in Durban. And of course, Ishe's book does, if we're talking about moving beyond the boundaries and all of that kind of thing in terms of curry, she goes all through the country, looking at various different ways people cook their curry. I think romanticizing this book is a little bit problematic for me, because again, the gaze, and I feel it's a little bit, it's still an Orientalist gaze, and it's still in some ways stereotypes, especially with all of this color, and it's exoticizes, still exoticizing, if not a particular group, but a particular, well, no, it's not even particular, but this thing called curry. There's still an exoticism, it feels like to me. But what was the other point that I had? Oh, yes. And then, the Indian Delights was, of course, like, this book that everybody went out and bought because it seemed to be Indian, to say something about Indian cuisine. And of course, my mother had it, and, a few other people in the family had it, but it also doesn't represent Indian cuisine. So very interestingly, my mother bought me a book by somebody called Kanti Iyer, who cooked very similar to my mother. It's stuff that I can understand. If I need a rasam recipe, I can go to that book, and I have an idea. I can relate to it in terms of language. I can relate to it in terms of ingredients. I won't find that in the Indian Delights, and I may not find it in Durban curry. So I didn't learn how to cook from my mother, but I kind of imbibed certain things, just from watching her and the smells and all of that kind of thing. But if I need to go for a recipe, I will find it in this really humble book, which is not beautifully graphic or anything like that. It's just been put together, but it's recognizable. And I think that kind of recognition is also quite important. In terms of representation, I don't find that don't find Durban curry to be very representative, even of somebody who has eaten sort of curry in all parts of the, the country. Anyway, that's all. I'm not going to go any further, but I just wanted to raise those few points, like erasure, power, and who gets to tell the story. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pralini. Vasu's back. Vasu, in your absence, I briefly chaired. Do you want me to continue, or?
Please.
Okay.
I'm apologetic about that. A little control.
Okay.
Or do you want us to take more questions before we respond? Because I was going to just briefly respond and then hand over.
I think there might be some connected comments or questions.
Okay.
Maybe I could just ask, and this is really very much what Pralini has already said, which is basically, can you say something a bit about Orientalism in relation to both the cookbooks in particular, and generally popularized representations and meanings attached to curry? I mean, I'm particularly struck by the whole idea of the redder the better.
Yeah.
And the idea of what is authentic is what is really hot, especially because, I mean, you were raising some of these issues around ethnic markers and intertext, intertext in the sense of different, how these texts are actually leaning on and bleeding into and being bled into by all kinds of other text in a colonial archive. So yeah, that's a sort of lead-on question.
Okay.
Are there any other related questions, or can we ask Vasu and Lebo to respond? Yeah. Okay. I think.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry,
That-
they are. Jared, sorry, Jared and Sheetal. Jared, I see your hand first.
Thanks very much to the presenters. It was a really fascinating and interesting presentation. I would like if the presenters could just reflect on two thoughts I had. The first of which is what was dealt with in quite a lot of detail was the gendering of the food work, the food practices, more broadly the food ways of curry, of preparing curry, making curry, the kind of gendered division of labor and how it's interpreted, represented. But I'm also quite interested in the way curry and other similar dishes can be deployed to recuperate and reinforce forms of gender in gendered or gendering relationships. So I'm often struck, for example, by a colleague of mine who remarked how she was making a curry for a family gathering, and her mother-in-law kind of shamed her because her curry wasn't how it is typically made in the family, or didn't taste the same as she does it. And my colleague was reflecting, not explicitly but implicitly, she wasn't necessarily being shamed for her curry preparation or curry making skills, but or her cooking, but in actual fact there was a kind of almost gendered, she was failing to fully become woman, become wife. So I hope I'm being clear. It's just around the kind of ways in which curry as a dish, as well as other dishes, can be deployed or employed to gender relationships, practices, and people. And then the last thing I was quite interested in, and it ties into some research I'm busy with at the moment, to do with one of the symptoms of COVID-19, as many of us may be aware of, is the loss of taste. And I'm really interested around the ways in which people are processing the loss of taste as a result of COVID-19 symptoms, and how it is experienced not just on a symptomatic level, but a deeply personal level in terms of the way people make sense of their food, make sense of themselves, how their food is a central part of themselves. So, and what I want to ask the presenters is, through your work in curries, your reading into curries, to what degree is taste or variations in taste or central to the food ways of curry? Sorry, I think I said quite a lot there, so I'm sorry.
So I'm going to ask Vasu and Lebo if they'd like to take those before we ask Sheetal, because there was quite a lot.
Yeah. No, thanks. I mean, I think they're really great questions, and I don't know if I have all the answers, Pralini. I got the tail end of some of the things you were talking about. I think your dislike of the Durban curry texts, and I think that's what texts do. They, you either love them or hate them, or you loathe them, and for justifiable reasons. I must say, I didn't get that sense of reading Durban curry, that there was a sense of the Edward Saïdian Orientalism or the exoticization. I thought it was fairly elegantly done in the grammar and the language, etc. And again, that is the act of reading a text. That's my sense. I didn't get that, but it's true that there is always, in framing and structure and representation, the prospect of exoticization. And one could frankly say that's probably typical of most cookbooks in some ways. If they provide an identity marker or an index of a geography, it does attempt to exoticize, exceptionalize, a particular ethnoscape, in this instance, curry, as we're aware of that. I mean, frankly speaking, as we've said, there is a sort of a perception out there that all of Indian food is curry, and even the notion of curry don't exist in India. I mean, I could be wrong, but I mean, everywhere I've read, this particular storyline came through. It's not described as curry. It's basically the sauce. There's such varieties in so many different ways. I suppose Lebo can also build on that as well. But Jared, your question's a very difficult one. I don't know if I have any, definitive responses there. I mean, we do touch, obviously, as you picked up, the gendering of food work as it also operates in cookbooks, and how cookbooks as texts of codification also change over time, etc. I don't think it resolves. We said very clearly, cookbooks and, the changes, they don't resolve gender problems. They kind of give you ways of reading them and seeing, what surfaces. But you're quite right about the performative dimensions of food across generations. I mean, culturally speaking, one experiences it, and it straddles all cultures, whether it's curry making or preparing, other dishes, etc. There's always a sense that the older generation know better and have a better way. And of course, recipes are all in the head. It's, it's mechanically produced, but the precision in terms of ingredients, textures, flavors, all done superbly, and that, a particular authority vests in individuals who prepare them, usually older. I mean, you used an example of how this is carried out in terms of the gendering of relationships. Again, I think it has much to do with questions around processes, power, attitudes, all of these things surface. So I don't think I'm offering any resolution or definitive ideas or responses. I must think a little bit more about that. But your final question around, taste, I think is absolutely critical. We don't go into great depth in the paper about taste or the presentation, but it's absolutely critical that taste is fundamental to the project of foodways, foodscapes, cookbooks, etc. Of course, it's not just simply ingredients, methods, techniques, flavors, aromas. All of that is contingent. Ultimately, the redder, the better. Yes, certainly color is one thing. You see it. It's the senses are always evoked in the project of food, and taste, no doubt about that, because very often the proof of the pudding, as is always said, is in the eating. And eating, to a large extent, is fundamentally about taste, but contingent on that is the project of smell. And so smell and taste are absolutely key to thinking about it. I mean, we touch on it peripherally in this book. In you see, you can only dramatize it via grammar, by explaining how people receive and produce the food. But you're quite right, in COVID-19, one of the effects obviously is not just simply the loss of taste. It is also, the question of smell plays a critical, because taste and smell are so critically connected. And for us, I think there's got to be greater work done in the project of taste. And how do you explain that, and how do you explore that further? I think there's huge room and scope for that in terms of cookbook analysis and generally, thinking and talking about food and eating practices.
Just to add, I think Vasu has responded to some of the questions, but just to indicate that in terms of exoticizing the curry and the Indian people by implication, in our analysis, we drew on the concept of nostalgia and nostalgic remembering. And our analysis highlights how, or suggests how, for example, nostalgia is often about, not only about remembering what was, it's about reflecting on what could be and what should be. So in trying to sort of conceptualize this authentic Durban curry, the tendency is then to essentialize and to exoticize, maybe unintentionally, but that as a tool, the concept of nostalgia, as for example suggested by the Russian American scholar Svetlana Boym, was useful in us thinking about why the search for an authentic Durban curry, when we know that food practices, food ways, and indeed personal family stories have evolved and do evolve over time and space.
Thanks
Okay.
both, Lebo and Vasu, for the responses. Sheetal, we've delayed you for a long time. I think maybe Sheetal, followed by Pralini, who's got a hand up again. I don't see any other hands or nothing in the chat.
Hi, okay. Afternoon, everybody. I think Prof. Lebo commented on 2-3 things which I wanted to comment as well. But I also wanted to also just highlight and remind everybody that when one thing that came up very strongly when I was doing my research in terms of defining the curry and tracing it back, there's a very strong influence, Portuguese influence in terms of the Durban curry and understanding that term in context in terms of a definition. Portuguese people have also got their own, what's the word I'm looking for? Own way of a curry. You know, so that's what, you know, it just comes into play when we say that in India, that curry does not exist, what we refer to as curry. And the second comment I wanted to make as well, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I actually want to write about as well. And I've lived that experience. A very strong marker for womanhood, for being indicator of being socially acceptable, of womanhood as well, and possibly socially ready to become a bride, is your capacity to make a roti. And this is extended not only in India, it's extended to generations as well amongst the diasporas internationally. I've got cousins that relocated in the 90s to Australia, and they've noted the same thing, for instance, with the migrant diasporas around there. So we talk about food being an identity marker in so many other spaces other than gendered spaces as well. And then the other thing that I wanted to just, you know, highlight as well is the fact that, you know, the whole, for me personally, authentic foods are very strongly related to foods becoming exotic. And a lot of the time, the exoticness it's more like you've highlighted as well. It's about marketing. It's about enticing the correct audience, enticing the book sales, making sure that the image is correct. And so the exotic is often created by cookbook authors.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's never really been exotic, but it may just come from a very authentic space and is presented in that way. That's just what I wanted to share with everybody.
Thanks, Sheetal. For those were more than, I think, more along the lines of comments, but I think that and Lebo might want to respond. Pralini?
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that it's not actually about taste. So I really do. I love a bunny chow, and I love a lot of what is so-called Durban curry, and possibly, you know, implied in the book. But what I was saying is, who tells the story? You know, who tells the story? So even in those sort of even in this whole idea of nostalgia, remembrance, all of those kinds of things, those are kind of quite deeply political and important things to be happening in spaces where those voices haven't had a chance to express themselves. And have been silenced. So those are important things. So when communities don't get to tell stories which reflect all those very varying, nuanced things, and especially power. I mean, power has a lot to do with it. Some of those exotic dishes like a tripe and trotters and all of those kinds of things came about because of poverty, as we all know, right? But what happens is it does get romanticized in a book like this. And so it's kind of like a symbol of diversity without actually exploring all those the ideas of power. How did this come about? Why did this come about? What led to this? Why is it different? Why is Durban curry different? There's a reason Durban curry is different to any other place in the world. There's a very particular history, and that history has to do with power. And again, who gets to write this book? Whose name gets to be put on the cover? It still has to do with power. So that's all I was going for. And yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Pralini. It also makes me think Luanda Scott had his hand up. Luanda, did I see a hand, or was that a mistake?
Hello, everybody. No, it was not a mistake. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to go ahead, but maybe now that I'm on.
For it. Go for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this presentation. This is absolutely fascinating conversation, and so I've been, as I was listening to this, and also listening to Pralini's comments about exoticization of food. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I agree 100%, because I'm also thinking. I get the critiques that are being, and the questions that are being put on the table, but I can't help but also think of I don't know if I can call it a movement, right? But these kinds of new publications that have come about in the last couple of years, particularly by Black young people, where there's a kind of a movement to claim or to centralize, quote unquote, non-white food, right? So where indigenous plants, indigenous things are being incorporated into recipes and foods that have not been centralized or been part of, the food books in kind of the South African, culinary production of books, if you want. And so I was wondering about this, right, in the one aspect, and then this movement with curries. So I'm not saying so I'm wondering about.
Oh, Luanda, am I the only person who's not hearing you?
No.
Oh, okay.
He's muted himself.
Oh.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
I think you accidentally muted yourself. Please continue.
Okay, I can't remember now where I was when I was muted. But I was talking about these production of books, right, that with these new authors. I'm thinking now from the top of my head, but like the Lazy Makoti and all these other texts by Black young people who are writing about quote unquote non-white food and indigenous, South African foods, if you want, which I suppose that itself can be problematic in some ways. And I'm wondering about how we can think about those in relation to the curries that we are talking about currently, and I mean, and taking seriously Pralini's questions about exoticization, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Wando. I agree with you that I think this is a really important conversation, and debates around authenticity and what cultural resources mean to people and how to kind of define their meaning. It's so important for us to have this discussion. So I'm very glad we are. Are there any other comments? Yeah. Okay. Trevor. I think, Trevor, that's really a comment. Vasu and Lebodin, if you want to respond to that, you can all see it. Pralini also, the importance of multiple voices. Any other questions or comments? I'm sure people have thoughts, and please, this space, as the students who've just joined the project, I hope you realize this is an open space for you to also contribute. It's really not a space for you to listen and learn. It's for us to all share ideas. Sheetal, is that your hand again? Or...
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Pralini was saying. I mean, if you look at the subgroup ethnicities in Durban within the Indian community. For example, I've looked hard and looked wide. Do you know, just out of interest, and there's not a single recipe book or even a recipe that speaks to Parsi cuisine, and we've got a population here in the country that falls within the Indian diaspora. So the concept of multiple voices is very, it's relevant, very relevant. So that's just one example of a cuisine variant that's been totally excluded of what we understand as Indian cuisine in South Africa.
That is an interesting observation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, even there was a group called, the Parsi people, and there was another group, but I think they're diminishing now. The name at the top of my tongue is not coming. But and that's just like Pralini says, it depends who documents and who writes.
Yeah. I wonder if, anyway, lots of people here, so please, who would like to comment or ask a question? And Ayona raised her hand.
Yes, yes, Prof. Thank you, Prof. I just want to say, like the others have said, that this is a very interesting, it was an interesting presentation, and we are having a very good and enriching discussion. I just want to say that I don't know if I should say I feel what Pralini is saying, about how, I mean, she's asking who tells the story, who creates the archives and all that, who gets to be the historian. Now, I think the main thing there is, the official histories and the social histories. So you find that the official histories are valorized at the expense of the social histories, the histories on the ground, people who, while on the ground doing their everyday thing, they live their real life, but you find that now others will come and then they'll take those stories and commercialize them, and because of that, you may now come across such eventualities as misrepresentation and even distortion. But just like how also Vasu said earlier on, that, that is just a story, not the story. In other words, then it's not absolute. It's just that one of the things that is being said about that. And obviously, then there will be contestation. And I think that's why now maybe it may also fall on the others also to come out and also tell their stories. But as each of us tells our stories, we should perhaps be very careful. I don't know if we should be careful about such words, such terms as authentic. What is authentic and what is not authentic? Because as we begin now to use such words as authentic, then we are erasing the other stories actually, which could be actually now authentic. And here we're talking about diversity, you know, authentic. I mean, authenticity needs diversity. Thank you.
Thanks very much for those comments about authenticity. I wonder, Vasu and Lebo, if you want, because in many ways, I mean, I think your central argument in Search of the Perfect Curry is precisely a critique of the idea of authenticity.
Yeah.
Indeed. So I couldn't agree more with all of the views that have been expressed, particularly that of who's telling the story. And that is precisely what we were trying to say in the article. So the article is a textual analysis of these two texts, and we acknowledge very much in the article that there like loads, tons of texts that we could have drawn on, but we focus particularly on those. So for me, the comments then have implications for the work that we need to do in the critical studies field. So maybe the new students could identify opportunities for further research, presenting these multiple or drawing on these multiple voices, for example, or identifying what the two texts, what stories the two texts are not telling, and tapping into those stories. So thank you for those very useful comments.
Yeah. If I could just, thank you. If I could just add to that, yes, I mean, I fully agree with the comments. I mean, in a way, we offer a reading against a set of ideas and concepts, etc. And I did say at the beginning that, and I think the kind of questions, you know, at a discursive level, who speaks is quite relevant, but also it has implications, I think, at the level of political economy as well. The questions around interests, etc. But just to return to the question around, you know, who speaks is not a new debate. It's not only relevant to a cookbook, it's relevant to basically all texts that are created. I mean, what we see happening here is, you know, Friedman and Platter are structuring a set of vignettes and narratives and recipes that they have determined represents Durban curry. That on its own opens up huge prospects for analysis. A question that arises, you know, reminds us of who speaks beyond who tells the story. And of course, it reminds us also of the classic Spivak essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And I think the real issue is that I wouldn't want to sort of, you know, label everybody subalterns of the text, the recipe text here. But the real issue is how and to what extent are the voices structured, and what takes place in this game. And I think that warrants, importantly, the kind of questions that I think Reddy was raising as well, which I fully agree with, that speak to questions of authenticity. How is it to be understood? I think we say in this reading, if you like, that authenticity is discursive. In other words, it's shaped by a range of powerful configurations, identities, class, attitudes, views, assumptions, all those sorts of issues. But what do the texts do in that process? They try to create an imagined community to some extent. Lebo was taking us through questions around, you know, tell cultural tales in the plural rather than the singular. And so I think the kind of criticisms and observations coming out really useful for us to think about other ways of reading. Yes, I recognize performativity is quite critical, but there are many, many more issues to surface in this. I recognize equally another reading of these texts, of course, the question of offals as food products are often viewed, historically, the way they come from, it's a food of working class people, often, but yet they become delicacies in their own right. Lamb shank today is so expensive, nobody can afford it. But of course, if you go historically and looking at lamb shank, it was actually a very cheap cut of meat. For example, for those who eat meat, I'm using that as an example, and so on and so forth. So the issue that Sheetal raises is quite important. Again, I think what we're saying is that there's no full, complete representativity. The texts strive towards that, but they don't fully represent, what we as society would deem appropriate. So there are gaps. Certainly I would agree with you, Sheetal. Parsi food, which is, for colleagues who don't know, is have very much strong Persian influence, which represents a particular ethnic community. And there may well be a minority in South Africa, but you're quite right. You very rarely see Parsi cuisine represented in texts. So yeah, we can go on and on, but I think, my view is that this issue around cookbooks, they're incomplete texts. They always exoticize, even if they claim they do not. There's always that element, and they leave out things that we are talking about that are so relevant to think about food and its meanings. Yes, right?
Thanks, Vasu. Thank you very much for that. Amara and Ranjit have their hands up. So I think if they could both, Amara and then Ranjit. I think Amara's disappeared. Amara, are you there? You're still on mute. You had your hand up, or maybe that wasn't. Okay, I think maybe let's just, Ranjit, do you want to?
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to say that I'm actually tuning in from Indonesia, and so a little bit far away from everyone else on the call, I think. I just wanted to, the whole thing is very interesting, and thank you, Vasu, for your presentation. But I just want to sort of talk about the idea of authenticity, because I grew up in India, so one could argue that that's sort of the mothership, or where everything kind of originated. But I also lived in America. I lived in Hong Kong, and I live currently in Indonesia. And I've traveled to various parts of the world with with a very significant sort of diaspora of Indians. But I've tasted curries in all these different countries, and they're authentic to their region. For example, Singapore, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and all these other places. They're different from, I suppose, what one might consider one's own authentic version. And I think ultimately authenticity is relative. And as you were just saying, Vasu, about cookery books telling stories and taking your stories with you. And I think that the people who write them obviously convey, again, that's another whole thing of relativism, right? They convey their own sort of ideas of the cuisine and adapt it to the countries where they're based. And ultimately, I think that these things tell us stories that are connected to that particular region and are just as interesting and authentic as anything else. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us from very far away. Amara, are you back? Amara's not back. Okay. Anybody else want to say something? I think there was something in the chat. Krivani, do you want to rather just make that comment? I think everybody can read it. May I add that there should be an exploration of amalgamation of recipes like lived experiences, for example, the communities, families, particularly in far-flung farming communities. the evolution of community of vegetarians, then there's a different, but yeah. So yeah, I don't know if you want to just add to what you said there.
Thank you, and apologies for joining late. Mine is just an addition of a community of families, particularly in the agricultural sector and in far-flung places like far north KwaZulu-Natal, where communities have been living in harmony and sharing not only lived experiences, but the camaraderie, in food, found in food. So where once upon a time there were vegetarians, Hindu vegetarians are now embracing the cultural practice of slaughtering, which I find incredibly interesting. And our differences are not that far apart. If you look at the example that I made, and please forgive my pronunciation. At home, we call it sangati, which is a product very similar in ingredient and style to that of pap or putu, but it's a bit more of a liquid form of the same ingredients. But it's a staple for both the South Indian community and that of the Zulu community. And I just feel that there's an exciting story to be told about how these two communities not only lived in harmony, but over the decades have kind of, their lived experiences have really become what the new generations is the only thing that the new generation knows. And I think that not much has been written or about that, and perhaps there's an opportunity for that there. Thank you.
Thank you. It also makes me think about just the extent to which so-called cuisines, separate, foods that are believed to be distinct to particular groups in South Africa have for centuries been incredibly hybridized. And that, the effort to separate them is actually part of a political project. It's a cultural project that has very significant political meanings. Vasu and Lebo, do you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, if I could just, I think they're really valuable suggestions and ideas coming from colleagues Krivani and Rajit. Very, very important indeed. I think, what it suggests is that, critical food studies needs to be looking at these issues, beyond the cookbooks, etc. I'm aware, Sangati is quite a tradition. I never liked it, frankly. Sorry, Krivani, I just don't like it. I just don't like the texture. But usually always goes with fish curry, rather interestingly. And my grandmother used to make it, and you're quite right. It has, I don't know what came first, to be quite honest. It's not, again, the question of authenticity, but there's at an ingredient level and method, probably great similarities in terms of pap and sangati and so forth. And there's stories to be told about that. And of course, interestingly, in Durban curry, pap features as the starch component to some fascinating recipes, and they're really take a new life. But I think beyond the surface of the recipes, probably useful to think about these deeper questions around how food and ingredients and methods come together, and in some ways also how they pull people apart, frankly, worth thinking through. Desiree?
Thanks very much, Vasu. I really do think that this has generated some very rich conversations and debates, which will definitely be taken forward, whether, in other discussions or in students' work, or in the, I think certainly in the forthcoming conference. So please, people who don't yet know about the conference that's going to be organized by the Critical Food Studies program, please do look out for it. I'm just checking to see if there aren't any final questions or comments. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Vasu and Lebo if they want to just wrap up.
Yeah. Before the final comments from the audience, I just wanted to point out, in terms of authenticity, if we extend it beyond just the curry and Indian cuisine, about pap, just how an African pap is, especially the pap made from maize or corn, how it is a colonial import. And over the years, it has now morphed into, if you are asked about African cuisine, the first thing we think about is pap. And pap is not an African cuisine in reality. So there's work to be done there in terms of indigenous foods and non-indigenous foods. So extending this debate about authenticity, inauthenticity beyond just the curry to other food practices.
Indeed. If I could just build on that one, I mean, Lebo zeroes in on a very important point, which we didn't bring out, but frankly, I mean, the chili would not have been a factor in India had it not traveled with the Portuguese, quite frankly, and the history tells us that. Similarly with potatoes, I mean, where do they come from? From South America. Similarly, mealies and corn, very much so. And so ingredients themselves travel. So those stories need to be told in a way to say, you know, how would it have been otherwise had this not been the case? So the question around authenticity and hybridity is really so meaningful when we think about how entangled not only recipes may be or dishes, but ingredients, and in many ways also method. Desiree?
No, absolutely. I see Amara's hand is persistently up, but she's not getting.
You can hear me.
Oh, okay, we can hear you now. Please go for it.
Oh, sorry. I had some trouble with the mic.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Hi, everyone. Amara here. I was going to say, firstly, I enjoyed the presentation so much. It was really colorful. Also, I feel like everyone's just sick and tired of this, but authenticity. It's not to critique or anything, but just to comment on authenticity itself and how a dish can really be authentic. As a Muslim in Cape Town, like the Cape Malayan community is big in Cape Town, and even with our community itself, like I do believe that there aren't some authentic Malay dishes. Reason being is that I feel like the Cape Malay itself, that identity is like kind of just layered upon layer upon layer. Like my grandmother, for instance, she's like what, she's 70 odd. So she makes and bakes savories. And even though you get the traditional samosa or pie or whatever, right? She has changed some of her fillings or the items that she does make to kind of just keep up with consumer trends and to kind of suit her audience taste, which has done great for her business. But also with food itself, and I think to an extent because of globalization, is that you can see how food kind of moves from country to country or culture to culture. Because aside for us just getting like the Durban curry or the authentic Indian curry, there's also like other cultures that do have their own version of it, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I just wanted to comment on that and like kind of how food has become this almost like this universal language in a way that it connects people. We'll be able to see these similarities with other cultures and not just this one specific thing that is authentic or like so focused on a specific ethnicity group. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Amara. I think that the conversation around authenticity is something that you say you don't want to return to, but we must. You know, I really think we need to thrash it out because it's been used in the name of often very dubious and problematic and you know, projects that take us into kind of dead ends, either dead ends or places that are actually quite destructive. Pralini's comment here is heritages are so fluid and dynamic, the print medium can be a reification. And yeah, I think the role of the written word, the printed word can work to reduce what is incredibly flexible, which is why, yeah, it's interesting to think of how written recipe books compare with, recipes that are passed down by, through the spoken word, through people speaking and telling stories. I'm starting to ramble now for some reason. Anybody want to say anything? Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up. Lebo, Vasu, can I say something about the next seminar or before you?
Yeah, I think maybe, I don't know, may I go? I'll make some
Please,
closing
please,
comments.
please,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, look, I mean, I really found, the comments and the questions, suggestions made by people on the platform so useful to think about other ways of, thinking about these issues and the topic more specifically. And again, our intention, as we said, was not to present
Vasu is gone again.
Oh no, that's really a great pity because he always disappears at a crucial moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, for me, what has been highlighted in the discussions this afternoon is just the methodological, if not the focus implication of this kind of work. I'm thinking, for example, in this article, what we did was textual analysis. And what the various comments have highlighted was a need for more community-based kind of research, but also the significance of methodologies such as memory work. So just to the students, the kinds of directions they might want to take if they're interested in taking this work forward.
Thanks, Lebo. I wonder if Vasu's back. I don't see him.
Vasu?
Nope. But no, that's really pity. So yeah, Lebo, thank you very much. And to Vasu in his absence, thank you very much. I think we all found this thoroughly engaging and really want to talk more and want to debate more and probe more. But let me just say that we will be probing more in a different direction next month. The advert will go around. The topic will be African feminist knowledges of food. Very often African women are subjected to research in terms of what work they do on food, but the focus is really on how African women have produced very important knowledges about food that are also related to knowledges about health, well-being, and so on. And we'll have 3 very interesting speakers: Patricia McFadden, Mersha Abrams, and Mersha Andrews. And oh God, I'm so brain dead today. Who's the third person? Lebo.
Oh God.
Who's the third person? Oh, Yvette Abrams.
Yeah.
Eco-feminists. They've been working in this area as academics and activists for many years, so please don't miss that. Yeah, so for now I'll say goodbye to everybody and thank you all for attending. Lebo and Vasu, thanks once again.
And Vasu says thank you, he got cut off because he doesn't have electricity.
Oh God, okay. Thanks so much. Bye everybody.
Bye.